The sun has always been there, shining intensely and guaranteeing life on Earth. Since the beginning of humanity, we look at him as the inexhaustible source of light and heat, the star who rules our days and makes possible the existence of the world as we know. But what if he suddenly started to erase? Not at once, but slowly, almost imperceptible at first, until the planet entered an irreversible state of darkness and cold. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to witness the last days of the sun? How would this affect our climate, our oceans, plants, animals, and of course humanity? Could we find a way to survive, or were we condemned to extinction? The first thing that would happen would be so subtle that it would go unnoticed for most people. The sun would begin to shine with a little less intensity, but not enough to be noticed with the naked eye. The days would still seem normal, but scientists would be the first to detect something wrong. Observatories around the world would realize that the star is releasing less energy than expected. Small variations in brightness could be recorded, which would light up a warning among experts. But what would this mean to life on Earth? At first, not much. The global temperature would fall into fractions of degree, nothing that awakened immediately, but over the years, these changes would become increasingly evident. The seasons would begin to deregulate. Winter would arrive early and would last longer, while summers would become short and milder. Tropical regions would still feel heat, but temperatures would no longer be the same as before. Places that previously had moderate winters would begin to face constant snowfalls, and areas that never saw snow before could be surprised by cold storms. The oceans would begin to feel the effects even before humans realize. With less heat coming from the sun, the evaporation of the water would decrease dramatically, causing a drop in the rain cycle. Some areas of the planet would face prolonged droughts, while others, such as poles, would begin to accumulate more ice than ever. The impact on the ecosystem would be catastrophic. Plants, which depend directly on sunlight to perform photosynthesis, would begin to weaken. Some species could adapt to a smaller amount of light, but others would collapse quickly. Whole forests could begin to die slowly, and with them the animals that depend on these plants to survive. This would have a chain effect, affecting the entire food chain. Herbivores would have less and less food, and consequently, carnivores would also face difficulties. The world would go into a mass extinction process, similar to what happened to the dinosaurs, but this time caused by the sun itself, or rather by their absence. For humans, the first direct impact would be the feeling of constant cold. Even with clothes and heaters, temperatures would begin to fall significantly. The demand for electricity would increase absurdly, as we would need much more warming to stay alive. Fossil fuels would begin to run out quickly, and humanity would go into a desperate race to find alternative energy sources. But with an increasingly weak sun, even solar energy would become ineffective. The plants that depend on sunlight to generate electricity would begin to fail, and many cities could dive into an energy collapse. Now, imagine society in the face of this new reality. Fear and despair would spread rapidly. Scientists around the world would try to find a solution to reverse or slow down the process. But what could be done? If the sun was really dying, there would be no one to do beyond trying to adapt to an increasingly cold and dark world. In an attempt at survival, countries could get into war for resources. Foods would become scarce, as harvests would be drastically reduced. The richest nations would have the advantage of building great underground refuges, while the poorest would face the worst consequences first. Now I want to know about you. If the sun started to erase slowly, how do you think humanity would react? Would we try to adapt or collapse? Comment down here. We would survive the cold if you believe we would find a way to continue existing, or humanity would not resist, whether it would be the end of civilization. If the sun started to erase slowly, life on Earth would never be the same. The planet would go into an irreversible cycle of transformation, where cold, darkness, and scarcity of resources would become the greatest challenges for humanity. Our civilization has always adapted to climate and environmental change, but it will be that we could resist a cosmic event of this magnitude, or would we be bound to disappear like so many other species throughout the history of the planet? The scary is that this is not just a science fiction scenario. The sun, like any star, has a life cycle, and one day it will really go out. Of course, this will happen in a very distant future, in billions of years, but what if any unexpected phenomenon accelerate this process? Would governments and scientists already develop secret strategies to ensure the survival of humanity? Are there already plans for the creation of colonies on Mars, self-sufficient space stations, or even the search for a new habitable planet for when this moment arrives? What makes this subject so fascinating is that it involves not only science, but also deep philosophical issues. If the sun started to disappear before our eyes, how would it change our way of thinking? Would we come together as a species to find a solution or continue divided, wasting resources with conflicts and wars? Our existence on Earth has always depended on the light and warmth of the sun, and its death would not only mean the end of life, but also the end of all that we build as civilization. Now I want to know about you. If I knew the sun is slowly erasing and that the Earth will enter a cold and dark age, what would you do? Would you try to survive at any cost, or accept the inevitable? Comment down here. Humanity will find a solution if we believe we could survive, or there is no way to escape fate, whether this would be the definitive end of civilization. If the sun started erasing, the first signs would be almost imperceptible. At first, nothing would change dramatically to the ordinary human being, which would continue their routine without noticing any change in the brightness of the day. But for scientists, the first evidence would emerge in detailed measurements made by spatial telescopes and solar monitoring satellites. Small fluctuations in sunlight intensity could be detected by sophisticated instruments even before any visible change occurred. Thermometers around the world would record a subtle drop in the average global temperature. In the beginning, we would be talking about fractions of degree, something that could easily be ignored or confused with normal climate variations. However, as the years passed, these changes would begin to become more evident. A little longer winters, less intense summers, and average temperatures slowly falling every decade. The real impact would come when ecosystems began to feel the effects. Photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert sunlight into energy, depends directly on the amount of radiation that reaches the Earth's surface. With less light available, plants would have more difficulty growing and producing oxygen, affecting not only flora, but the entire food chain. Small changes in this balance could lead to catastrophic events, such as rainforest collapses and the death of phytoplankton in the oceans, microscopic organisms that are responsible for much of the oxygen we breathe. Migratory animals would be the first to feel direct effects. Many species depend on solar cycles to know when it is time to move to warmer or colder regions. With a weakening sun, these patterns would begin to change, disorienting birds, fish, and mammals that always followed a natural rhythm based on daylight. Whole species could simply disappear because they cannot adapt enough to these new conditions. At the same time, the oceans would begin to cool. Sunlight does not only heat the Earth's surface, but also regulates the water temperature of the planet. Oceans are responsible for storing and redistributing heat, directly influencing the global climate. If the amount of energy received by the sun decreased, the ocean currents would collapse. The famous Gulf Current, which carries heat from the tropics to the northern hemisphere, could slow down or even stop, causing Europe to get in accelerated cooling. Meanwhile, other parts of the world could face extreme droughts, as less evaporation would mean less cloud formation and less rain. The days would begin to look slightly darker, not like a sudden night, but as if there was a permanent thin mist in the sky. The mornings would be less bright, the Antarcticas would seem shorter, and over the years this change would become increasingly evident. Cities that were previously bathed in intense light during the day would have a cooler and more grey climate, similar to what happens in prolonged winters. The psychological impact of this on humanity would be immense. Desde the ancient times, the sun has been a symbol of life, power, and stability. Entire civilizations based their calendars, rituals, and beliefs in the constant presence of this star. But as their light weakened, people would begin to feel a growing fear of what would come. Pessimism would take over entire societies, increasing conspiracy theories, panic, and even conflicts between countries, desperate for finding solutions to a problem that no one could stop. The global economy would also be affected. The agricultural sector would face increasing challenges as the growth of plantations would become more difficult with the reduction of sunlight. Prying income would begin to decrease, forcing countries to adopt new technologies to compensate for the drop in food production. This would make food more expensive and scarce, generating economic and hungry crises in various parts of the world. And we can't forget about technology. Solar panels, which are one of the main bets for a sustainable future, would lose efficiency, becoming a less reliable energy source. This would force governments and companies to seek other energy alternatives quickly. At the same time, the reduction in solar radiation would also affect the ozone layer and the circulation of winds in the stratosphere, altering climate patterns in ways that we cannot yet fully predict. Governments would begin to invest heavily in research to try to understand the phenomenon and find possible solutions. But what could be done? If the sun was dying, would there be any way to rekindle it? Scientists could propose ambitious projects, such as the use of mega-espello in space to reflect more light to the Earth, or even attempts to reactivate the nuclear fusion of the sun using futuristic technologies. But would any of these solutions work, or would we just postpone the inevitable? While scientists debated these issues, the public would be increasingly apprehensive. If the sun was dying slowly, humanity would be in a race against time. What to do to ensure the survival of civilization, abandon the planet and get a new home from another star, building underground cities heated by the heat of the Earth's core, or accept that our destiny is sealed and that life as we know is coming to an end. Now I want to know about you. If scientists announced that the sun began to weaken, how do you think the world would react? Do you believe that humanity would find a way to survive, or we would be walking to an unsolved future? Comment down. Here, technology will save us. If you think we will be able to develop an alternative, or there is no escape, if you believe it would be the beginning of the end to our civilization. With sunlight weakening, what would happen to the global climate? Would the Earth enter an irreversible freezing? This is the scariest question of this scenario. If the sun were slowly losing its intensity, the planet would begin to feel the increasingly severe impacts. At first, as we mentioned, the changes would be subtle, but as the years passed, a new climate cycle would take over the Earth, taking the planet to a state similar to an ice age. Temperatures would fall dramatically, first unevenly. Regions closer to Ecuador would still be able to maintain some heat level, but the poles would begin to expand quickly. Antarctica and Arctic glaciers would advance on the continents, covering large areas of North America, Europe, and Asia. Entire cities would be buried under layers of ice that would grow year after year, making life impossible in these places. Those who still tried to resist would face an increasingly intense cold that would destroy plantations, freeze rivers, and make outdoor survival impossible without specific equipment. The impact on the atmosphere would be catastrophic. Hot air rises while cold air descends, creating wind patterns and atmospheric circulation. But with the lack of warmth of the sun, These patterns would begin to destabilize. Hurricanes of intensities never seen before would emerge in various parts of the world as the Earth would try to balance its internal temperatures in unexpected ways. Large cold air masses would move to tropical regions, while violent storms would reach areas that were previously relatively stable. The oceans, which have always been natural regulators of the planet's temperature, would also begin to feel the impacts. Surface waters would freely freeze, first in the polar regions, then advance to lower latitudes. At first, this would happen only in winter, but as the years passed and sunlight continued to decrease, the ice would stop melting in the summer. This would create a dangerous cycle. More ice was formed, more sunlight would be reflected back into space, further cooling the planet. This phenomenon, known as albedo feedback, could accelerate the global freezing process. If cooling became extreme, the oceans could freeze up to hundreds of meters deep. Marine life would collapse, as many species depend on stable temperatures to survive. The layer of ice that would form would prevent the change of gases between the water and the atmosphere, killing integer ecosystems. Oxygen dissolved in the oceans would decrease dramatically, leading to extinction of various life forms. Meanwhile, on land, whole forests would disappear. The trees could not withstand such low temperatures for long periods, and tropical species would simply enter extinction. Only the most adaptable life forms could resist. But in a world where the cold is constant and sunlight is scarce, biodiversity would be drastically reduced. Animals that depend on heat and abundant food, such as large mammals, would probably not survive. But impacts would not just be limited to biology and climate. The infrastructure of modern cities would begin to crumble. Frozen highways would become impassable, electrical networks would collapse due to extreme cold, and drinking water supply would be severely affected as pipes and reservoirs would turn into ice blocks. Big cities would need to be abandoned, with whole populations migrating to the few places where the cold would still be bearable. And how would countries be in this new reality? Conflicts between nations could arise because of increasingly scarce natural resources. Food would become gold, as traditional agriculture would become almost impossible without enough heat for plantations to grow. Only those who had enough technology to cultivate food in controlled greenhouses could ensure long-term survival. Given this apocalyptic scenario, humanity would have to seek new forms of survival. Some could try to build underground cities where the heat of the Earth's core would still provide some source of heat. Others would try to develop advanced technologies to produce sufficient artificial light to sustain agriculture and create alternative sources of thermal energy. But would all this be enough? Or would the Earth come into an irreversible freezing cycle, condemning humanity to extinction? Now I want to know about you. If the Earth started to enter a new ice era, where would you try to take refuge? Do you believe that humanity could survive the extreme cold, or we would be doomed to disappear? Comment down here, we would survive on ice if we think we would find a solution, or there is no escape if it believes it would be the end of civilization. With the Earth turning into an ice planet, how would humans try to survive? This would be the greatest proof of resistance of humanity. The extreme cold would take over almost the entire globe, turning metropolises into white and frozen deserts. The natural landscapes we know, such as tropical forests and fertile fields, would disappear, replaced by vast extensions of snow and permanent ice. The planet that was once blue and green now would be white and hostile. Survival would no longer be a matter of gradual adaptation, but a race against time. Civilization would need to act quickly to ensure that at least a part of humanity was still alive. At the beginning of the collapse, the richest countries would try to prepare in advance. Advanced technologies would be developed to create artificial refuges capable of enduring extreme cold. Underground cities would be one of the most viable solutions. Near the Earth's nucleus, the heat would still remain intense. offering an environment where the temperature could be controlled and kept at acceptable levels for human survival. Gigantic tunnels would be excavated, and whole complexes would be created below the surface, equipped with artificial lighting, atmospheric control, and food production structures. But would there be room for everyone? The dispute for those who would be entitled to these underground shelters would be intense. Governments would probably select only part of the population, choosing the most qualified, scientists, engineers, doctors, and political leaders, to ensure that civilization could be rebuilt in the future. The rest of humanity would be left to face freezing temperatures on the surface, where death would only be a matter of time. The cities above the ground would quickly become uninhabitable. The ice would take over the streets, the buildings would collapse under the weight of the accumulated snow, and the system electrics would fail due to extreme temperatures. Communication networks would collapse, and people who were not protected would die frozen or hungry. The few survivors who could not access underground cities would try to find other ways to resist relentless cold. Some communities could settle in natural caves, taking advantage of the protection against the cold winds and the geothermal heat from the depths of the earth. Others could look for alternative forms of energy to keep heating systems working. But without fossil fuels or reliable solar energy, that would be an almost impossible task. With oceans freezing, fishing, which was once an essential source of food for billions of people, would become unfeasible. Traditional agriculture would also collapse, because without sufficient sunlight and freezing temperatures, no plantation would survive. The only alternative would be to create underground farms using artificial lighting to cultivate vegetables and create small, controlled greenhouses. But production would be limited, and food scarcity would lead to an unprecedented global crisis. The price of food would become absurd, and only the most privileged would have access to a minimally adequate diet. With increasingly scarce natural resources, conflicts between countries would become inevitable. Those who still had any source of heat and food would be the targets of the desperate nations. The wars would no longer be locked by oil or territory, but by simple survival. The few regions of the planet that were still habitable, perhaps close to geothermal sources or natural heat pockets, would be strongly disputed. Borders between countries would cease to exist, and humanity would enter a period of total chaos. The concept of society and civilization as we know would disappear, giving way to a constant struggle for the right to exist. Meanwhile, scientists would desperately seek a solution to reverse or at least postpone the total collapse. Could humanity be able to develop technologies to reactivate the sun? Some could propose the creation of giant mirrors in space to reflect sunlight to the Earth. Others would try to build huge nuclear fusion reactors to generate enough heat to supply entire cities. But any of these solutions would require decades to be developed, and time would be something humanity simply would not have. Given this bleak scenario, one last alternative would be left: to abandon the Earth. If life on the planet became impossible, the only hope for human civilization would be to seek a new home among the stars. Emergency space missions would be organized, bringing a small group of people to colonies on Mars or frozen moons that might be able to shelter life. But how many could escape? The space would not offer shelter to everyone, and only a small fraction of the population could have a chance to survive. The rest would be forced to face the cold until no one remains. Now I want to know about you. If the Earth was turning into an ice planet, where would you try to take refuge? Do you believe that humanity could survive, or we would be condemned to the end? Comment here below, underground survival. If you believe that living underground would be the best option, or humanity would not resist, if you think this would be the end of. If you got here, congratulations. You are part of the select group of explorers of the unknown who really want to understand the greatest mysteries in the universe. Now tell me, if the Earth was freezing and you needed to choose, where would you try to take refuge? In an underground city, or would you try to escape to another planet? Comment down here. I would survive underground if you believe this would be the best option, or humanity needs a new home if you think the only way out would be to abandon the Earth. And since you watched until the end, don't forget to leave your like. This helps the channel too much to grow and makes this content recommended for more curious like you. Subscribe now and activate the bell, because every week we have new videos exploring apocalyptic scenarios, amazing theories and discoveries that challenge our understanding of the universe. And look, here is already appearing a video that will explode your mind. What if humanity needed to leave Earth forever? Click now and continue this journey by the unknown.